Hello and welcome to the MedSoc 2022 closing plenary from Dr. Ruth Pearce. Unfortunately, we had some technical issues on the day. This meant that the plenary was delayed and so there wasn't time for a question and answer session, and the recording of the plenary missed the very beginning of the talk. We've therefore edited it now so that anyone who wasn't there in person can see the entirety of the plenary. And that includes my introduction now. So, to introduce Dr. Ruth Pearce, she's a lecturer in community development in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. Her work explores issues of inequality, power, marginalisation and transformative political struggle from an interdisciplinary trans-feminist perspective. She joined the school and the community development team in July 2021 after having held a series of roles in the voluntary sector and precarious academic posts in research and teaching. She got her PhD from the University of Warwick in 2016, and this explored trans health and how it's differently understood in trans communities, activist groups and professional literatures, with a range of meanings and practices contested both within and between these spaces. And she published findings from this work in her book, Understanding Trans Health. She also edited and contributed to the essay collection Turf Wars, Feminism and the Fight for Transgender Futures in the Sociological Review monograph series. She's co-editor of the Community Development Journal, a senior fellow at the Centre for Applied Transgender Studies, and sits on the editorial board for the Bulletin of Applied Transgender Studies. And she's also a former member of the editorial board for the Sociological Review. So let me introduce you to Dr. Ruth Pearce's closing plenary for MedSoc 2022, From Birth Parents to Backlash, Doing Sociology of Health Amidst Culture Wars.
The argument here is that there's certain epistemological commitments that are common in the academy, including sociology, and historically these have drawn from white and particularly white male viewpoints. And this can differ from the perspectives of the people who research maybe is being done on or even not done on. We can see an example of this in a lot of the conversations over the last few days about clinical trials and the very rational, grounded reasons given historical and contemporary abuse that members of racialized minorities, for example, and also other groups such as disabled people might not trust these ways of obtaining knowledge. So Patricia Hill Collins argues, therefore, for even though this might not be understood as real knowledge or an appropriate way to do it, for nevertheless creating a black feminist sociology that reflects the specific standpoint, the embodied experience, the knowledge of black women within a racist and sexist society. Importantly, though, what she's also saying is that this is an example of something that affects groups more widely, and she invites people to use her theories in this way. Quote, "Black women's experiences highlight the tension experienced by any group of less powerful insiders, encountering the paradigmatic thought of a more powerful insider community." In that vein, in this talk, I'm using a trans-feminist perspective, a trans-feminist epistemological perspective. My PhD looked at people's experiences of trans healthcare services and also the contention of discourse across professional settings and community settings, as well as activist settings. And rather than attempt to summarize an entire thesis, I played you the song NHS Vulva, or half of the song, which was my attempt with my punk band Dispute Settlement Mechanism to summarize all of that. And in a sense, I do that job. Now, one of the things I also did in that song, in the same way that I do in my thesis and my book, Understanding Trans Health, is I included autoethnographic elements. I drew on my own experience where they illustrated something that was present in the wider data set, particularly if it wasn't necessarily ethical to report on other people's experiences directly, but I could on my own. I am the she in the song. The description is of my encounter with a surgeon who, in doing a checkup on a later date, told me, "Now you have girl parts, you can be expected to be treated like a girl." So my thesis, and for that matter the song, note that trans people face specific social, economic, and healthcare challenges, but also necessarily trans researchers are going to face those same challenges as I have. I've therefore argued for what I call a methodology for the marginalized. I argue that marginalized researchers require an ethical responsibility towards the self, both in terms of epistemological commitment, but also in terms of acknowledging that the harms that we face, and, for example, seeking counselling. But lest we descend into an individualistic situation where marginalized scholars are responsible entirely for handling their own oppression, I also argue for the importance of a supportive community of scholarship. This is something we have to do together to make the academy something that we can all enter. In a sense, what I'm arguing for is survival, collective survival, as an aspect of methodology. If I didn't have an ethical responsibility towards myself and I didn't have a community scholarship around me, I wouldn't have been able to complete the research. Now, another example of how this plays out in practice is the story of my friend Helen. This is a photograph from her room in our home, which we called Trans Manor in Leamington Spa, where a collection of trans people all live together. And we've got a view out the window of a suburban landscape in a small English town. There's some nice snow as well. Helen was a great friend. We met shortly before my PhD. We lived together during the first few years of that. We spent a lot of time watching science fiction and fantasy shows. She introduced me to Game of Thrones when it was still cool. We would cook together, we would listen to music, dance around together in the kitchen. We had great times. But sadly, she experienced both chronic physical illness and difficulties and mistreatment in seeking healthcare because of being trans. And because of her continuing healthcare problems and the failure to address them, mental and physical, she started seeking suicide. So we supported her through a number of suicide attempts while I was attempting to conduct my studies and also attempting to earn money through teaching and administration jobs. One morning after I hadn't heard from her for a while, I realized that no one had seen or heard from her. And I asked a friend what I should do. We agreed I should go and see if I could go into her room, even though I was worried about disturbing her. I went downstairs, I knocked on her door, and when she didn't answer, I went in and found that she was no longer with us. Now, drawing on C. Wright Mills, what I'm interested in is how this personal trouble was part of a wider social issue. I tell this story not because I had a hard time, but because lots of people are having a hard time. The trans mental health study was, at the time of Helen's death, the largest population study of trans people in the UK. And in the findings, 84% of respondents reported experiencing suicide ideation, and a third of respondents reported having attempted suicide at least once. Consequently, many trans people knew other trans people who had taken their own life, and most of us know trans people who have attempted suicide. This is the context in which I was doing my studies, and it is the context in which most trans people will be doing their studies. This is why we need methodological approaches which take problems such as high suicide rates into account. And once again, like Collins, I'm using this simply as one example of a wider set of problems. Just as it is a problem for me as an academic when I am doing impact work to go into a meeting with NHS staff and I have to act polite in front of the surgeon, who I mentioned earlier, who is regularly at these meetings when I am doing this work. I am also increasingly afraid of being disrupted while undertaking talks. Last time I addressed a room this big, there was an anti-trans protest from a small group within it. And the reason for that particular problem is that since I did my PhD, things have got a lot weirder. Part 2, Culture War.
Breast milk. Why is that on your mind? Focus, Ted. If you got off Trump's teat a little bit, maybe you wouldn't be thinking about breast milk so much. Do your damn job.
On Cuomo Primetime Wednesday, Chris Cuomo called out Republican Senator Ted Cruz for tweeting about breast milk during the impeachment trial earlier in the day. Cruz tweeted in response to a Washington Examiner article about one hospital in England that advised nurses to use language that may be more friendly toward the trans community. Cruz is one of several GOP senators who have come under fire for not paying attention during the impeachment proceeding.
So, I had a weird experience last year. I had been doing some impact work, as the university encourages us to do, indeed expects us to do if we want to keep our jobs, with Brighton and Sussex University hospitals. Specifically, I'd given some advice on guidance that was in preparation by midwives on trans inclusion. And I was a little bit surprised to firstly see the headline I've got here from the Times. Breastfeeding is now chest feeding, Brighton's trans-friendly midwives are told. And secondly, I was surprised to see this travel across the Atlantic and suddenly become a news item in the Trump impeachment trial. Most disturbing of all, I was named in the Times. Here's the extract. I'm going to read it to you. Dr. Ruth Pearce, a feminist sociologist who was an external reviewer for the policy, tweeted, "This is absolutely groundbreaking work on trans inclusion in perinatal services from the BSUH Maternity Gender Inclusion Midwives team." This was the first I saw of this in the Times, by the way. They didn't ask me, they just trawled through Twitter. The article continues, however, the language changes have attracted criticism online, with one Twitter user saying it will lead to, quote, the erasure of women, and another arguing it was, quote, peak misogyny. It was also branded truly shameful, absolutely unnecessary, and guaranteed to harm women in another tweet. So this is how I felt when I saw this. It is a meme, a popular meme based on The Simpsons character Ralph Wiggum, a small child sitting at the back of a bus on his own, and the caption says, "Chuckles, I'm in danger." So why were we giving advice to Brighton and Sussex University hospitals? I was drawing on research from two projects, the Trans Pregnancy Project, which was an ESRC-sponsored international research project, and Improving Trans Experiences of Maternity Services, or, because we love acronyms, ITEMS. And here are some findings. This is a quick whip through a whole series of findings from those two projects. We found that trans birth parents, that is, trans people who conceive and give birth to their own children, are wrongly portrayed as unusual or exceptional in a lot of media coverage and conversation. As a result, they are not expected. They are unexpected bodies. They're what's been called by Epstein space invaders in perinatal services. So there's often a lack of understanding and formal support from service providers. In the items report, we found that only 42% of respondents said that they were spoken to in a way that respected their gender all the time, i.e., a majority was spoken to in a way that didn't respect their gender when they were accessing perinatal services. That led on to our major finding from that research that was 30%, nearly a third, did not access NHS or private midwives during their pregnancy. We did some digging into this, and for a lot of people, it was because of fear or concerns about how they would be treated. And this was compounded for trans people who experienced forms of intersectional oppression. For example, trans people of colour who risk medical racism and transphobia when attempting to access services. So that's why gender-inclusive language is so important. But we were also feminist projects. We think it is very important to talk about and to name women's health, given the historical issues with how women have been treated and are still treated and sidelined in healthcare services. Consequently, the guidance had the following section, which was available for Times journalists to read. And I quote, The vast majority of midwifery service users are women, and we already have language in place they are comfortable with. This is not changing, and we will continue to call them pregnant women and talk about breastfeeding. Adding to the language we use, and that people are comfortable with, ensures we are providing individual care for every person. In short, this was a lie. Oh, it's happening. It's happening again. When I am contacted by, the Times, or not contacted, and I see myself, I wonder what's being written onto my body and the body of any researcher doing work in this area. Because the story, of course, spread. That's how it reached New York. That's how it reached the Times. That's how it spread across the world, the same lie, the same information, right? This idea that I am causing harm, this idea that I am shameful, or that those of us who do work, feminists who do work in this area, are shameful or dangerous. And the lie spreads, and the lie spreads. A slap in the face of motherhood. So, why is this happening, right? Why are we experiencing this now? I argue that there's three aspects to this. The first, in specific to the trans question, is the anti-gender movement. So this is a movement that's opposed to gender egalitarianism and sexual liberation. But the named thing that it's opposed to is gender, right? You can see this if you saw the news a few years ago about the prominent gender theorist Judith Butler, and there was an effigy of her burned ahead of a talk in Brazil. That was the anti-gender movement. Now, this emerged in the 1990s from anti-feminist currents in the Roman Catholic Church, but in the 2010s it's been adopted by far-right actors and those associated with other elements of the political spectrum more widely across the world. In a sense, this is a moral panic. I'm not going to theorize this in detail, but there's a lot of work on moral panics in which there's sort of a lot of misinformation and inconsistency, but that's part of the point. Opposition to what's called gender, or in a sense what they call gender ideology, or they call genderism, or they call gender theory, which I know some people here are guilty of, quote, have become empty signifiers, flexible synonyms for demoralization, abortion, non-normative sexuality, and sex confusion. Gender ideology, or even just gender, is whatever it is that you're opposed to. And in the UK, where a lot of religious attempts to oppose gender have been less successful, we've seen this more successfully laundered through so-called gender critical groups. I've got a couple of pictures here. The one at the top is a far-right Catholic protest in Poland, and there's some people with a banner saying "Stop Gender." But the one underneath is a supposedly feminist protest in the UK, and they also want to stop gender. And they're saying, respect my sex if you want my X, i.e. my vote. You can also see this in the slogan, sex, not gender. So that brings me on to the next aspect of this. I've already used the phrase trans question. I've taken that out of an article from well-known left-wing publication, The New Statesman. The Tories are right to debate the trans question. So this moral panic specifically emerged out of backlash to proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act in 2017. And these were going to make it very slightly easier for some trans people to change the sex marker on their birth certificate. Now, there's been an endless circulation of misinformation in the media about this and about related issues that have spun off it, every kind of topic you might imagine. I gave the example earlier of the Times report and just how inaccurate it was. Now, we're seeing normally several articles like that published every week, sometimes several every day, and that's been the case for the past 5 years. Trans people in these articles were usually positioned as inherently threatening to women and girls, although womanhood and girlhood is often portrayed in a particular way associated with cis, white, and middle-class women in a lot of these articles. There's also a focus particularly on trans women, such as myself, as the most dangerous of all. But again, as we see from the Times article, trans men and non-binary people can also be targeted. There's an element of political opportunism to the way that this has infected our politics. So in 2017, that recently, it was the Conservative Party, the party in power, that was arguing for mild reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, as was the Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats. We now have a situation where all of those parties, but particularly the Conservatives, are openly trying to win votes on the back of transphobia and homophobia. And I would argue that this is part of a deliberate attempt, and it has been explicitly stated by some conservative Christian groups in the United States. This is a deliberate attempt to split feminist and LGBTIQ+ movements. You can see that in the Times article in the way that I am positioned as a feminist sociologist, but then positioned as dangerous to women. You can also see it in groups such as Women's Declaration International, who submitted evidence to Parliament a couple of years back, calling, and I quote, for the elimination of transgenderism. Now, I'm a woman of Jewish heritage. My grandmother fled the Nazis, fortunately successfully, in the 1930s. When I see language calling for our elimination, when I hear the same people calling us parasites, that's a direct quote in Parliament, and when I see references to the trans question, I am concerned. But instead of reporting on this critically, what we're seeing is this question over and over again. Are women being erased? Are women being erased from childbirth? Are women being erased in literature? Are women being erased from the abortion rights movement? Women are being erased. Why can't we say woman anymore? Woman, 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 woman. I move my lips, you cannot hear a word. It is simply not being said, especially at this conference. The third aspect of this is to remember that this is not just about trans people. The point I'm hammering home, it's all part of a larger picture. The trans moral panic is part of a wider pushback, part of a wider political polarization led by the resurgent far right. And this has to be understood again in context. We're talking about countries such as the United Kingdom, and for that matter, Russia, that have not reckoned with the legacies of colonialism and empire. We have this idea that we're the good guys now. That's the discourse, right? Everybody's celebrating the Queen and her great contributions without any critical conversations taking place about what the monarchy might represent. We're also operating within the long shadow of the 2008 global recession. People have been experiencing economic shock for over a decade and are looking for solutions. And the far right can offer them solutions in finding scapegoats. Obviously, it's not just trans people. I have an example up here of the RNLI lifeboat rescuing migrants from the Channel. These are not people who are a threat to us. And yet both the migrants themselves and the RNLI have been portrayed as such, again, in an attempt at creating political divisions which can be profited from, a distraction from economic woes. And so, you know, in the UK, we call this the post-Brexit era, but as I've noted, this is international, right? This is also the post-Bolsonaro era, the post-Erdogan era, the post-Orban era, the post-Modi era, the post-Trump era, the post-Putin era. Leaders who have benefited from the proliferation of misinformation and from intentional backlash to the demands of progressive movements, which often liberal outlets, commentators, and academics play along with. So in this context, academics can become culture war targets. I've got a picture here of my Member of Parliament, Michael Gove. Genuinely, I'm going to move to Glasgow soon, I'll be out of here. He's often misquoted as saying that people are tired of experts. So I'm going I'm going to say what he actually said. Quote, "I think that the people of Great Britain have had enough of experts with organizations from acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong, because these people are the same ones who got consistently wrong." I've got some more examples here. I'm going to talk about one of them. I've got this picture of a newspaper, and that's from a blog post by Prof Gopal, who's a professor at the University of Cambridge. And she was targeted for talking about the processes of racism on social media. And the response, and this is not the only time she's been targeted, but the response was this 2-page spread in the Daily Mail. How can Cambridge let this hate-filled Don pour out her racist bile? Now, this is a process that Sarah Ahmed's talked about, whereas if you talk about the problem, you become the problem. If I, as a feminist, talk about problems with inclusion in maternity services, I become an anti-feminist target. If Professor Gopal talks about racism, she becomes a racist in the eyes of the media. We faced backlash specifically to the Trans Pregnancy Project as well, including harassment on social media, freedom of information requests. As an academic, people can ask to see our emails, right? And that wasted a lot of our time, as well as was very disturbing. Complaints about the project to our head of school, to the Vice-Chancellor, and to the ESRC who were funding us. Most disturbing was the doxing of the project PI, Sally Hines. Doxing is when someone maliciously shares your address on the internet. And the first she knew about this was when she got a phone call from the police in the middle of the night. Now, this happened because she posted a picture, not this picture. She kindly shared this one with me. She shared a picture of her dog, Pip, online. And if I do a little bit of a computer enhance, you can see that if you're really obsessed with hating on a research project, you might be able to zoom in on the dog's collar, take a researcher's home address from it, and then share it on other websites. So nothing we could do could prepare us for that. I mean, we now know to be far more careful with our information security. And nothing can prepare us for this, right? The ways people talk about us. But we did take proactive measures, which I'm going to return to shortly in the interest of time. But before I do so, I want to emphasize that in spite of all this horror, everything we did mattered, and I don't regret a moment of it. Sociology of health matters. Our research mattered to the Brighton and Sussex gender inclusion midwives who built it into their report. Our research mattered to our research participants. I have a quote here from Benjamin, not his real name. Quote, "We need this kind of research." Yeah, and because I felt it was also really well done research, well thought of, ethically sound, very respectable, also really filling a hole. Our research made a difference in the world. We know I have spoken to midwives and service users. We know it's an expanded understanding. We know it has resulted in improvements to services. So that leads on to part 3. We have a situation where research is particularly difficult for some of us who are marginalized and trying to work through the academy. We have the additional context of backlash. What do we do? Well, in order to explore that, there's one final bit of context I want to explore, and that's the Neoliberal University. We are under increasing pressure to perform, to undertake that very kind of impact work and social media work that made the Pregnancy Project such a target. We are under surveillance by institutions, and to get all Foucauldian, we also surveil ourselves. We can see this, for example, in the research excellence framework, right? And meanwhile, while we're expected to do this, there's an increasing context of precarity and casualization. Reliable jobs are slowly disappearing and being replaced with things that expect us to move around, work for short contracts, have a really hard time. And there are pay gaps for disabled people, for women and trans people and for people of colour. And all of this is compounding the inequalities that have always existed in Western universities. Racism leads to attainment gaps and harassment and abuse of staff. Women are more likely to be represented among junior colleagues, and increasingly that means among casualised colleagues. Equality schemes that aim to address these, ironically, often place an additional burden on the very people they're meant to help. For example, if women are expected to complete an Athena Swan submission for their department. Everyone's laughing in recognition. My argument here is that working in a university is, under the current circumstances, unhealthy, right? Which is quite interesting as a sociologist of health. But this burden of ill health does not fall equally. So, on to the final stretch, right? Survival of method as method. What does it look like? For the Trans Pregnancy Project, some things we did. Pre-prepared press statements. We were ready to counter misinformation. If the Daily Mail did a hit job on us, we had our statement ready to go with a simple key message. We undertook media and social media training, and the most important question that Transmedia Watch asked us was, who is your audience? Do you need to be on every platform? Do you need to be talking to the media for your impact, or do you need to be talking directly to midwives, commissioners, and most importantly, service users? Where we did use social media, we used Twitter because we could reach service users more easily. We used available tools like blocking tools and limited reply modes. We did brief managers, human resources, and comms officers that made a huge difference, for example, when there were freedom of information requests and they knew to expect it, and they knew that we hadn't done anything wrong once they saw the nature of it. We explained why we were at risk. However, it shouldn't be on the most marginalized people to make these explanations. So my argument both is that management in universities and HR should be doing this work themselves, but also if you are in a position of relative power, for example, as a PI or as a less marginalized colleague, this is something you can take responsibility for. I also think all of this, and I've kind of hinted at it, that's why it has to be collective, right? Just as we've got a lovely picture here of Pip with Sally's other dog, Doug the dog, and they're being colleagues together. So if you're a PI or you're working with more oppressed colleagues, do your research in advance. What are the areas of political contention in your research? What harassment and abuse might you face? And what survival strategies are the most effective? In short, don't assume it will be okay, and do take some responsibility for your colleagues' survival. Another way of thinking about this, in a sense of working within and possibly against the academy, is Anna Carlisle's idea of critical bureaucracy, which she's talked about in a context of education studies and working in schools. And she's thinking about how to align an ethic of social justice with inequitable models of policy and practice. She argues for building up incremental decisions that make a change and studying up on the techniques of mobilizing metaphors of power. In short, what do people with power over us, such as our managers, want? What power do we have? Perhaps it might be Athena Swan or the race equality scheme. And what demands, realistically, can we make? Some ideas that I've got. Collective survival is important. Networks for researchers with similar experiences. LGBT networks. Networks for scholars of color. Networks for disabled scholars. But also things like the hilariously named Emotionally Demanding Research Network, which is the research network which supports emotionally demanding research. The network itself is not emotionally demanding. I think equality schemes such as the Race Equality Scheme, Athena Swan, and Stonewall's Diversity Champions are incredibly important to support at this moment, even as we have to remain critical of them and the way that they use neoliberal logics, right? So I think we can have a critical support for them. For example, we can say, if you want us to do this, what are you going to give us, right? You can demand funding for events and networks. You can require different forms of promotion method from your university. You can ask for baby feeding rooms. There's all kinds of things that can be done. Ultimately, the message of all of this is don't be alone, and I mean that in terms of research and writing as well. I think it's important to attend to mental health. If you need help, seek help, but also it's not just on you. I benefited from reading feminist research by people who said I had to seek counselling after doing traumatic research. So I sought counselling after doing traumatic research. It made a big difference. But also, again, it's on us to look after each other. If you're writing a grant, budget for counselling, budget for therapy, budget for mentorship, and budget for time off for your junior colleagues, perhaps to do some work on their own work. I was able to publish my book within 2 years of finishing my PhD because in addition to working on the pregnancy project, Sally gave me time to do my own work. I, in turn, have tried to do this. I recently wrote a successful £600,000 grant with money for counselling and mentorship for a trans scholar of colour. If you're a supervisor or mentor, you can also prepare students and colleagues for distressing fieldwork. And my final point on here is don't create shit jobs. We all know what they look like. It's like, come and work for us. You've got 1 year. It's a 0.5 contract. We'll be expecting you to do full-time hours anyway, and you won't get time to do any of your own work. Which leads me on to my final point. It's the system itself that's broken, so as well as working within the system, we have to work against it. There's a vote coming up from the University and College Union. We're all tired of industrial action. I'm tired of industrial action, but it's always worth a pop, right? If you're not a member of the union, please join, please vote, turnout matters. And I'll leave you with this final thought from Patricia Hill Collins. Who has your back and whose back do you have? Thanks. I just want to really... I want to really quickly thank my friends who did, well, friends, I've only just met some of you, who did the wonderful job of disrupting my talk. That was very brave. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was wonderful. Please buy Ruth's book. And thank you, everyone, for your patience this morning. We're just starting the first sessions a little bit late, but we will catch up. We have built in time to catch up. So thanks, everyone, for your patience. And thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you.